After all the trouble we've been through, you want to marry me?
Well, I'm sure we won't get into trouble on a weekly basis.
For decades, Stefanie Powers and Robert Wagner were one of television's most beloved duos. Their on-screen chemistry and heart-to-heart made them icons of a golden era, the picture of elegance, charm, and effortless connection. To fans, they weren't just acting partners. They were soulmates, perfectly in sync both on and off the screen. But behind the polished smiles and witty banter, their real-life relationship was far more complicated than anyone ever knew. Now, at 82, Stefanie Powers is breaking her silence, revealing long-buried truths about her partnership with Robert Wagner and the unspoken pain that lingered between them for years. After decades of rumors, distance, and public speculation, she's finally ready to tell her side of the story. Wagner, who was once married to the late Natalie Wood, has long been surrounded by controversy, particularly after Natalie's tragic and mysterious death. And for years, Stefanie stood by him, fiercely protective of her co-star. But time has a way of changing perspectives, and what she's revealing now paints a very different picture of their bond, their struggles, and the emotional cost of fame. In her recent reflections, Stefanie opens up about loyalty, loss, and the painful reality of living in the shadow of a Hollywood tragedy that still haunts Robert Wagner to this day. It's a story of friendship, trust, and heartbreak, one that will leave fans stunned at the truth she's finally decided to share. When Heart to Heart premiered in 1979, audiences were immediately captivated by the irresistible chemistry between Stefanie Powers and Robert Wagner. They weren't just playing characters, Jonathan and Jennifer Hart, they were creating magic. Week after week, millions tuned in to watch them solve crimes, share tender glances, and deliver witty lines with effortless charm. The series wasn't just a hit. It became a phenomenon that defined an entire generation of television. What many people didn't know was that Stefanie and Robert's connection went far beyond the cameras. From the very first table read, there was an undeniable spark between them, not romantic, but deeply spiritual. "We just clicked," Stefanie later said. "It was as if we'd known each other in another life." But behind that warm partnership was a quiet understanding. Both of them had endured their share of pain. Robert Wagner had already faced tragedy with the loss of his wife, Natalie Wood, while Stefanie had recently ended a long relationship with actor William Holden, who would later die in a shocking accident. Both carried emotional scars, and perhaps that's what made their bond so authentic. They understood loss, loneliness, and the fragile nature of life in the spotlight. On set, they became inseparable. Between takes, they would laugh, tease, and talk about everything from fame to family. Crew members often said they acted more like old friends than co-stars. And while fans speculated endlessly about a romantic connection, the truth was something deeper. A mutual respect built on trust and understanding. But their friendship wasn't without challenges. Hollywood thrives on gossip, and with Robert Wagner's life still under a cloud of public suspicion due to Natalie Wood's mysterious death in 1981, Stefanie often found herself drawn into uncomfortable conversations. Journalists frequently pressed her for comments about Wagner's private life, and her loyalty was constantly tested. Still, she refused to waver. "Robert is one of the most loyal, kind, and misunderstood men I've ever met," she once said. "People forget that behind every headline is a human being." Her defense of him was steadfast, even when it affected her own reputation. Some industry insiders accused her of being too protective, too close, but Stefanie didn't care. She believed in his innocence, and more importantly, in their friendship. As Heart to Heart continued its 5-year run, the duo became symbols of sophistication and partnership. Their chemistry was so convincing that viewers wrote letters begging them to marry in real life. Even after the show ended in 1984, their connection remained strong. They reunited multiple times for TV movies throughout the 1990s, and each time it was as if no time had passed. But beneath the smiles and nostalgia, Stefanie began to feel the toll of years spent defending someone else's truth. "Loyalty can be a double-edged sword," she later admitted. "You give so much of yourself that sometimes you lose sight of your own story. That quiet confession marked the beginning of a shift. For decades, she had stood beside Wagner, shielding him from the worst of the public's judgment. But as she entered her later years, Stefanie began to reflect on everything she'd witnessed: the love, the pain, the questions that never went away. Now at 82, her tone has changed. Though she still speaks fondly of their partnership, there's a new honesty in her words, one tinged with regret and truth. "We shared a bond that can't be replaced," she recently revealed. "But there were things neither of us could escape. Not from each other, and not from the past." It's this new openness that has stunned longtime fans, because for the first time, Stefanie Powers isn't just remembering the past with fondness. She's revealing the emotional burden of being tied to one of Hollywood's most controversial figures, and the truth she kept hidden for decades. As the 1980s faded into the 1990s, the world changed, but the shadow hanging over Robert Wagner never did. The tragic death of Natalie Wood continued to dominate headlines, fueled by endless speculation and unanswered questions. Each new documentary, tabloid rumor, or police update dragged his name back into the public eye. And every time it did, Stefanie Powers found herself pulled back into the same storm she had spent years trying to avoid. For Stefanie, it wasn't just about friendship. It was about loyalty to someone who had shared her professional life so deeply that their names were almost inseparable. "I felt like I owed it to him," she once said. "We built something beautiful together, and I couldn't just walk away when things got ugly." But that loyalty came at a price. Producers began to hesitate before casting her in certain roles, worried that her association with Wagner might bring unwanted controversy. Tabloids began spinning wild stories about their relationship, suggesting everything from secret affairs to shared secrets about Natalie's death. Stefanie stayed silent, refusing to engage in gossip, but inside, it wore her down. In private, she often described the emotional exhaustion that came with defending someone else's truth. "I became tired of being the spokesperson for someone else's pain," she told a friend years later. "It wasn't my story to tell, but somehow I was always part of it." During this time, Stefanie poured herself into her work and her humanitarian efforts. After the death of her longtime partner William Holden in 1981, she founded the William Holden Wildlife Foundation, a project that gave her life new meaning. The foundation became her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her grief into something purposeful. "Saving animals saved me," she said softly in one interview. Yet even in her refuge, she could never escape the echoes of her past with Robert Wagner. When Heart to Heart was revived for reunion films, she agreed to return, partly out of nostalgia and partly because she knew that fans still cherished their partnership. "We were magic together," she admitted, "and that magic doesn't disappear, no matter how much time passes." But working with Wagner again after so many years wasn't easy. The chemistry was still there, but there was also an unspoken heaviness. Behind the cameras, there were fewer laughs, more pauses. "We'd both changed," Stefanie later confessed. "We carried more weight, not just from age, but from everything that had happened in between." She noticed how weary Robert seemed, how much he tried to maintain his charm despite the sorrow that followed him. "He wanted to be strong," she recalled, "but you could see the pain in his eyes. He had lost so much, and there were still things he couldn't say." Stefanie, ever the loyal friend, kept his confidences. But over time, she began to realize that silence can become its own form of burden. "You tell yourself you're protecting someone," she said in a recent reflection. "But sometimes, you're just protecting the pain, keeping it alive instead of letting it heal." As the years passed, her perspective deepened. She no longer saw their bond as something purely beautiful. It was complicated, tangled with guilt, loyalty, and emotional debt. "Robert was a dear friend," she clarified, "but we were also survivors, each in our own way. And sometimes survival means not talking about the things that hurt the most." When asked in a recent interview if she still defends Wagner against the public's suspicion, Stefanie's response surprised everyone. "I'll always care for him," she said carefully. "But there are truths only time can reveal. We were partners on screen, and perhaps in silence, partners in something much deeper, understanding that some pain never truly fades. Her words carried the quiet ache of someone who has finally stopped trying to protect an image and started accepting the truth of what really lay behind it. As Stefanie Powers entered her later years, she began to reflect more openly on the complexities of her connection with Robert Wagner. The silence that once felt like protection now felt like a heavy weight pressing on her conscience. For decades, she had brushed off questions about him, often smiling politely and changing the subject. But time has a way of softening the fear that once held her back. In her most recent interviews, Stefanie spoke with a rare honesty that startled even her most loyal fans. "Robert and I were always close," she began, "but it wasn't always easy. People think they know what we had, but only the two of us really understood it. And even then, sometimes we didn't." Her tone was gentle but laced with truth. She explained that behind their friendship was an emotional dependency, a need to protect one another from the loneliness that fame often brings. "He had lost Natalie," she said quietly. "I had lost William. We were two broken souls who leaned on each other in the only way we knew how, by pretending everything was fine." But she also admitted that their closeness sometimes blurred boundaries. "We were both guilty of hiding behind our characters," she confessed. "Jonathan and Jennifer were perfect, loving, loyal, glamorous. But we weren't them. We were human, fragile, confused, and often hurting." For Stefanie, the hardest part was watching how the world refused to let Robert escape the shadow of Natalie Wood's death. Every few years, the case would resurface, reopening old wounds. "It was cruel," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "People forget that tragedy doesn't have an expiration date. It follows you, even when you try to rebuild your life." She revealed that in private moments, Wagner confided his pain to her, not in detail, but through silence. "He didn't have to say much," she said. "You could see it in his eyes. The guilt, the grief, the exhaustion of being judged for something that only a few truly understood." Stefanie's compassion never wavered. But as the years passed, she began to see how much that loyalty had cost her emotionally. "You can love someone deeply as a friend and still recognize that their truth isn't yours to carry," she said. "I spent years defending someone when I should have been healing myself." Her words marked a turning point. The woman who once avoided controversy began to speak about emotional boundaries and self-preservation, topics she had long avoided. "When you spend a lifetime protecting someone else's pain, you forget to tend to your own," she explained. "That's what I did for far too long." Her candid reflections struck a chord with fans who had adored her for decades. Many admired her courage to finally speak freely, while others were shocked that she had carried such emotional turmoil for so many years. Yet through it all, Stefanie refused to cast blame. "I don't regret knowing Robert," she clarified. "He brought light into my life when I needed it most. But we both made mistakes, not out of malice, but out of fear." Now when she speaks of him, there's a sense of forgiveness, not just toward Wagner, but toward herself. "Life isn't black and white," she said with a faint smile. "People love, they hurt, they hide, they heal. That's what we did, over and over." Even in her 80s, Stefanie remains graceful and composed, her voice steady yet filled with a quiet sadness. She admits she still checks in on Robert from time to time, but their connection now exists mostly in memory. "We're both at peace, I think," she said softly. "The world can believe what it wants. We know what we shared, and that's enough." Her honesty reveals a woman who has lived through love, loyalty, and loss, and who now understands that speaking her truth doesn't erase the past. It simply sets her free from it. At 82, Stefanie Powers has finally reached a place of peace, though it came at the cost of decades spent carrying emotions too heavy to share. When she looks back at her life, she sees it not through the glamour of Hollywood, but through the quiet truth of survival. "You don't get through this business without scars," she once said. "But the scars mean you lived," and loved deeply. In recent years, she's chosen to step away from the spotlight, devoting most of her time to her wildlife foundation in Kenya. Surrounded by nature, far from the flashing cameras, Stefanie says she's found the kind of peace she never knew in Los Angeles. "The animals don't care who you were," she said with a gentle laugh. "They only see your heart." It's in these moments of solitude that she's begun to reflect honestly on her connection with Robert Wagner, the man who shared some of her most defining years, and whose name will forever be linked to both fame and tragedy. "Robert was a constant in my life," she admitted recently. "Even when we weren't working, there was always a bond between us, one built on trust, respect, and, yes, pain." For years, she defended him without hesitation. But as time went on, Stefanie realized that her unwavering loyalty had also trapped her in the shadow of his story. "I wanted to protect him," she explained, "but I didn't realize how much of myself I was losing in the process." Her new honesty doesn't come from resentment. It comes from understanding. "When you're young, you think love means saving someone," she said softly. "But real love means letting them face their truth, even when it hurts." The truth, as Stefanie now tells it, is that her relationship with Robert Wagner was one of the most meaningful and complicated bonds of her life. "He made me laugh when I didn't want to," she said. "He made me feel seen at a time when I was invisible to everyone else. For that, I'll always be grateful." But she also acknowledges that there were moments of emotional distance, times when the pain they both carried from their pasts kept them from fully healing. "We were both haunted by ghosts," she admitted. "His ghost was Natalie. Mine was Bill. And sometimes those ghosts were louder than our friendship." In one particularly moving interview, Stefanie shared that she's finally made peace with the questions that will never have answers. "People want truth wrapped neatly with a bow," she said. "But life isn't like that. Sometimes the truth is that you'll never know everything, and you have to live with that." She also expressed deep empathy for Robert Wagner, who continues to live under scrutiny even in his later years. "He's endured more than most people could bear," she said softly. "And yet he still stands. That takes strength." As for her own legacy, Stefanie no longer measures it in awards or fame. She measures it in lessons learned, in forgiveness, compassion, and resilience. "I've made peace with every version of myself," she reflected. The actress, the friend, the woman who stayed silent too long, and the one who finally spoke. "They're all me." When asked if she still speaks to Robert today, Stefanie smiled wistfully. "We've said all we need to say," she replied. "There's love there, not the kind people think, but the kind that endures. It's quiet now, but it's real." Her voice, calm and sure, carries the weight of someone who has finally stopped running from her past. "We were part of something special," she concluded. "And though time has taken us in different directions, I'll always be thankful that our paths crossed when they did." In the end, Stefanie Powers' story isn't just about fame or friendship, it's about healing. It's the story of a woman who spent her life loving deeply, losing painfully, and learning that peace doesn't come from the answers you find, but from the truths you're brave enough to speak. And as she stands today, graceful and unbroken, Stefanie reminds the world of something beautiful, even after a lifetime of heartbreak. It's never too late to reclaim your story and to speak your truth at last.